For years we were told the story in a single, tidy sentence. Princess Diana died and her two sons inherited her fortune. Clean, simple, the kind of ending that fits on the back of a newspaper and asks nothing more of you. But the truth was never that simple, because the person who ended up carrying the most precious, most visible, most instantly recognizable piece of Diana in the entire world was not her son. She wasn't named in Diana's will. She wasn't mentioned in the letter Diana wrote to explain her wishes. She wasn't even part of the royal family when those documents were signed. At the time, she was a schoolgirl in a quiet English county, with no idea that one day she would wear the very ring that started the whole fairy tale, and that the world would look at her hand and for just a second, see Diana again. What if I told you that the real heir to Diana's legacy was a woman she may never even have met? That the most important thing Diana left behind never appeared in any will, was never argued over in any courtroom, and was never something the lawyers could measure in pounds. And that the quiet way it changed hands rewrote the story of the most famous inheritance of the modern age. To understand how a complete outsider ended up at the very center of Diana's legacy, you have to go back past the crash in Paris, past the divorce, past the interviews that shook the monarchy, to a quiet day in the summer of 1993, when a young woman sat down to do something most of us put off for far too long. She decided what would happen after she was gone. Diana signed her will on the 1st of June, 1993. She was 32 years old. She was still married to Charles, still carrying out her royal duties, still living inside the machine of palace life. And like most people who write a will young, she did it with the quiet assumption that she had decades ahead of her to revisit it, to refine it, to fix anything she'd gotten wrong. The famous Panorama interview hadn't happened yet. The divorce was still years away. Paris and everything that ended there was 4 years in the future and utterly unimaginable. According to the probate filings made public in 1998, her estate was valued at around £21 million after inheritance tax was paid. The gross figure was larger, closer to £35 million, but the taxman took an enormous share, leaving roughly £21 million to be passed on. It was, in its own way, a modest document compared with the wills of other senior royals. Many of those are sealed by the courts, hidden from public view for decades. Prince Philip's will, for instance, was ordered to stay sealed for 90 years. Diana's, by contrast, became public, and what it revealed surprised a great many people. She named 2 people she trusted above all others to carry out her wishes: her mother, Frances Shand Kidd, and her sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodale. They were appointed as the executors and trustees of her estate, the people legally responsible for making sure everything was distributed exactly as she intended. Originally, she had also named her private secretary, Patrick Jeffson, but after he left her service in 1996, she quietly amended the will, replacing him with her sister. The end of that original 6-page document was signed simply Diana, in her firm, rounded handwriting. And then, the very next day, she did something that the law would later treat in a way she almost certainly never expected. On the 2nd of June, 1993, Diana wrote what's known as a letter of wishes. It wasn't the cold legal armor of the will itself. It was the human part, the place where she explained in her own warm words who she wanted to receive what and why. She asked that all of her jewelry be given to William and Harry, so that one day when they married, their wives could wear it. She asked that 3/4 of her personal belongings, her clothes, her photographs, her furniture, her artwork, the ordinary and intimate objects of a life lived in the spotlight, go to her 2 sons. And the final quarter she wanted shared among her 17 godchildren, children she had personally promised to help guide through life. She also left £50,000 to her butler, Paul Burrell, a man who had worked loyally beside her for the better part of a decade. It was a will written entirely in trust. Every line of it assumed that the people she loved would honor her words after she was gone. She had no reason to think otherwise. And that trust is precisely where the story turns, because within months of her death, almost every meaningful part of what she'd written would be quietly, legally, and secretly changed. Diana died on the 31st of August, 1997, in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. She was 36 years old. William was 15. Harry was 12. What followed was a wave of public grief unlike almost anything in living memory, an ocean of flowers outside the palace gates, a nation that seemed to stop breathing for a week. And while the country was still in mourning, while two boys were still trying to understand that their mother was never coming home, the cold machinery of the law had already begun to move. In December of 1997, barely 4 months after the funeral, Diana's mother and sister went to the High Court of Justice in London and requested something called a variation order. Stripped of the legal language, it's a request to change how an estate is distributed, to carry it out differently from how the deceased actually wrote it down, and the court granted it. The first change was about time. Diana had been clear. Her sons should inherit their share when they turned 25. The variation pushed that back by 5 full years, to the age of 30. The brothers could begin drawing income from the trust at 25, but they could not touch the capital itself, the real body of the inheritance, until they were 30. The justification offered was that 2 young men living under the relentless glare of the world's press shouldn't come into millions of pounds too soon. And perhaps there's some reason in that, but notice what sits underneath it. Diana had specifically, deliberately chosen 25, and the decision to override her was made without consulting the boys, who were still minors and who had just buried their mother. The second change cut far deeper, and it stayed buried far longer. Remember the godchildren, the 17 children Diana had wanted to share a full quarter of her personal belongings. Under the variation order, that vanished. Instead of a meaningful portion of her possessions, each godchild would now receive a single item, and the families wouldn't even get to choose it. The executors would select the objects themselves, not a quarter of a lifetime of treasured things, chosen with care. One object, handed down by someone else's decision. And when the families eventually saw what they'd been given, the hurt was real and sharp. Some of them described what arrived as little more than a tacky memento, a small piece of china, a figurine, a coffee set, the kind of thing that carried no real warmth, no genuine connection to the woman they were supposed to be remembering. These were not strangers. Diana had personally chosen these families, had asked them to be part of her own children's lives. And quietly, almost invisibly, the next generation of those families was edited out of her legacy. What makes it harder to forgive is the secrecy. Nobody told the godchildren's families what Diana had actually wanted. The letter of wishes was never disclosed publicly during the probate process, and the executors didn't inform the families that it even existed before they went to court to change it. For years, those families had no idea they'd been promised so much more. The truth only came to light by accident. It surfaced during a completely separate and very public court case involving the butler, Paul Burrell, who in 2002 stood accused of taking items from Diana's estate. It was in the glare of that trial, years after the fact, that the families finally understood what had been quietly taken from them. And by every account, they felt deeply betrayed. So how was any of this even possible? How can the clearly written wishes of one of the most famous women on earth be overturned within months of her death? The answer comes down to a single word, and it's a word that estate lawyers now repeat to their clients like a warning. Diana's letter of wishes used soft, gentle language, words like wishes and discretion. It expressed hopes. It trusted. It did not command. And because she had granted her executors discretion, the law handed them the power to use it however they saw fit. A wish is not an order. The lesson lawyers now draw from Diana's case is blunt and a little heartbreaking. If you truly want something honored after you're gone, you must write it directly into the will itself, never into a soft letter resting gently beside it. That then is the part of the story most people half remember. The delay. the forgotten godchildren, the secret order that rewrote a dead woman's wishes. By the time both princes had passed the age of 30, their individual shares had grown to roughly £10 million each, somewhere around $16 million apiece, after years of careful investment by the royal advisors. But here's something the money itself can't tell you. The very same inheritance meant two completely different things to the two brothers, and that contrast reveals exactly what Diana's legacy really was. For William, the money mattered, but it was never the foundation his life rested on. As the future king, his security was always guaranteed by the institution itself. Today, as Prince of Wales, he controls the Duchy of Cornwall, a vast private estate worth well over £1 billion, generating millions in income every single year. Against a backdrop like that, his mother's inheritance was a meaningful and treasured gift, but it was never the thing keeping him afloat. It was extra. A foundation laid beneath a foundation that was already solid. Harry, it was the exact opposite. For Harry, that money was a lifeline. In his 2021 interview with Oprah Winfrey, he spoke about what happened after he and Meghan stepped back from their roles as senior royals, how the family, he said, had cut them off financially. And he was open about the fact that it was what his mother had left him that made their new life possible. Without it, he said plainly, they simply could not have done what they did. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. The money Diana set aside in 1993, when Harry was just a small boy who still climbed into her lap, became the very thing that let him walk away from the institution that Diana herself had wrestled with for so much of her life. In a quiet, almost poetic way, her final gift to her younger son turned out to be a kind of freedom, the very freedom she was never allowed. Now, there is an open question here, and it's important to flag it honestly as exactly that, a question, and nothing more. Some observers have wondered whether the long delay in the inheritance happened to suit other interests too. For years after Diana's death, around 150 of her personal possessions toured the world as part of an exhibition organized by her brother, Earl Spencer, and her belongings drew paying visitors to the family estate at Althorpe, where she is buried. Did that play any part in the decision to push the inheritance back? Nobody can prove it did, and it would be irresponsible to claim otherwise. It simply remains one of those quiet, unanswered questions that lingers over the whole affair, never confirmed, never quite dismissed. But none of that, not the trusts, not the timeline, not the money divided between two princes, is the real twist of this story. Because the single most famous object Diana ever owned didn't go into a trust, or to a charity, or into some faceless fund managed by advisors. It made a long, strange journey, and it ended up on the hand of a woman who wasn't even in the will. To understand how, you have to follow the path of one ring. It's a 12-carat oval Ceylon sapphire, surrounded by 14 brilliant diamonds, set in 18-carat white gold. When Charles proposed in 1981, Diana chose it herself from a catalog produced by the royal jeweler, Garrard. That choice quietly scandalized parts of the palace, because it meant that any member of the public, in theory, could have walked in and ordered the very same ring. There was nothing exclusive about it. And yet the design itself carried a deep history. It was inspired by a sapphire piece that Queen Victoria had treasured more than a century earlier. But none of that is what made it priceless. What made it priceless was Diana. She wore it, and in wearing it she transformed an off-the-shelf design into one of the most recognized pieces of jewelry on the face of the earth. Today it's valued in the hundreds of thousands of pounds, but its true worth was never measured in carats. After Diana died, the boys were allowed to choose keepsakes from her belongings, and for well over a decade, the public was told a very specific, very moving story about what happened next. The version went like this. William chose his mother's Cartier watch, a gift she'd received for her 21st birthday. Harry, the younger son, chose the sapphire engagement ring because, as the butler Paul Burrell later recounted, it reminded him of being a small boy holding his mother's hand, feeling that big stone press against his little fingers. And then, the story continued. When William was ready to propose to Kate Middleton in 2010, Harry generously gave up his most cherished possession, handing the ring to his older brother so that one day Diana's sapphire might sit on the hand of a future queen. It was a beautiful tale. Two grieving brothers, one selfless gesture, their mother's memory carried forward in love. There was just one problem with that story. According to Harry himself, it never actually happened. In his 2023 memoir, Spare, Harry took aim at the entire touching scene and dismissed it completely. He wrote that he had never given William the ring, because the ring had never been his to give in the first place. William, he said, had already asked for it after their mother died, and Harry had been more than happy to let it go. There was no handover, no tender moment between brothers in a hallway, no bonding gesture for the cameras of history. The version the world had cherished for 13 years was, in Harry's own blunt words, simply not true. So which brother is telling it straight? In all honesty, we may never know for certain, and it's better to say that plainly than to pretend one version is settled fact. But here's the thing that cuts straight through every contradiction. It genuinely doesn't matter which account you believe, because both of them end in exactly the same place. The ring left the brothers behind entirely. In October of 2010, on holiday in Kenya, William proposed to Kate Middleton with his late mother's sapphire. When he was asked about it afterwards, he explained, in his own gentle way, that it was how he kept his mother close to the moment, a way of making sure she didn't miss out on the day. And that is the moment the whole inheritance story quietly changes shape. Think hard about who Kate was back in 1993 when Diana put pen to that will. A 12-year-old girl, a child in Berkshire with no connection whatsoever to the royal family, no place in any of Diana's plans, no line in any document. She was never named. She was never imagined. She was, by every possible definition, an outsider. And yet she is the one who now wears the single most iconic object Diana ever possessed. The ring that began the fairy tale. The ring photographed millions upon millions of times. The ring that for an entire generation has simply become Princess Diana. That is the unexpected heir, not by law, not by blood, not by anything written down, but by something no will could ever capture and no court could ever override by meaning. Diana's sons inherited her money. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, inherited her image. And it doesn't end with the ring. At nearly every grand state banquet, Catherine appears wearing the lover's knot tiara, that delicate cascade of diamonds and dangling pearls that Diana wore so often the two women have become almost impossible to picture apart. But here the truth needs real care, because this is exactly the point where careless retellings get it wrong. That tiara was never Diana's to leave to anyone. It was created for Queen Mary back in 1914, passed down to Queen Elizabeth II, and only ever loaned to Diana, given to her around the time of her wedding, and then returned to the crown after her divorce. It was never part of Diana's estate. It was never hers to bequeath. It is now loaned in turn to Catherine. And yet, every single time Catherine wears it, she reaches back across the years and stands precisely where Diana once stood. A former royal butler has suggested she chooses it so often as a deliberate tribute, a quiet way of keeping her late mother-in-law present in the room. Whether that's truly her reason, only Catherine herself knows. But the effect on all of us watching is undeniable. She first wore it in 2015, the first time anyone had worn that tiara since Diana's death. The symbolism was impossible to miss. This is what alters the royal narrative. For years, the inheritance was framed as a question of pounds and trusts, and the precise ages at which two princes could unlock their fortunes. But the deepest, truest part of what Diana left behind never appeared in a single court filing. It didn't go through probate. It wasn't argued over by lawyers. It passed to a woman that will never mentioned, and it passed not through the law, but through love, through marriage, through a son's simple wish to have his mother present on the most important day of his life. And there's a quiet irony in all of this that's almost hard to bear. Diana spent her years inside the monarchy feeling, by her own account, unseen, misunderstood, and trapped. She struggled against the institution again and again, and yet that same institution is now the very thing keeping her most alive in the public eye. Every state dinner, every photograph of that sapphire catching the light on Catherine's hand, every glittering appearance of the lover's knot tiara is the royal world choosing, over and over again, to keep Diana in the room. The machine she fought against became the frame that holds her picture. So when we say Diana left everything to one unexpected heir, this is what we really mean. Not the money was always going to her sons, exactly as everyone assumed. We mean the part of her that the world genuinely remembers. The image, the glamour, the almost supernatural ability to make millions of complete strangers feel something just by walking into a room. All of it now lives on through a woman who married into the family long after Diana was gone. A woman who carries it with a quiet, steady grace that Diana herself was so rarely permitted to enjoy. Diana wrote her will at 32, completely certain she would have years and years to perfect it, to fix it, to make sure every wish was honored down to the last detail. She didn't get those years. The people she trusted most changed her wishes within months. The godchildren she loved were quietly forgotten. The court rewrote her careful timeline behind closed doors. So much of what she planned with such love slipped straight out of her hands the very moment she was no longer there to defend it. But the one thing none of them could touch, the one thing no variation order could rewrite and no executor could redirect, was where her memory chose to live. Nearly 3 decades after that night in Paris, her sapphire still catches the light at the front of every royal photograph. Her favorite tiara still crowns the woman who carries her title, and that woman wears it all not as a stranger borrowing a dead woman's things, but as the most unexpected keeper of a legacy the family never saw coming. The girl who was nowhere in the will turned out to be the truest heir of all. That is the real inheritance, and the strangest part of all is that it was never written in the will at all. So I'll leave you with the questions that people still argue about to this day. Whose version of the ring do you believe? Harry's blunt account in Spare, or the tender story we were all told for over a decade? Do you think Diana's mother and sister made the right call in delaying that inheritance, or did they overstep the wishes of a woman who could no longer speak for herself? And here's the big one. Do you think Diana would be proud to see her legacy carried so faithfully by Catherine, or quietly heartbroken by everything her executors changed the moment she was gone? Tell me in the comments below, because I read them and I want to know where you land. And if this story moved you, take a second to like, to subscribe, and to turn on notifications. Because the royal world guards its secrets carefully, and we are only just getting started uncovering them.